Good afternoon and welcome back, everybody. Matt Helms here. I'm excited to have this panel discussion of the Regen innovation journey. I was thinking about what I would call this little discussion here, Mike and Randy, and I'm going to call it the top 10%. You may or may not know, but only about 10% or less of startup companies end up being successful. And I think Randy and Mike would both say, hey, we're not there yet. We've got work to do, and that is the truth. But we have an opportunity here today to really have a discussion and learn from their journeys individually, the startups that they have founded and led as CEOs, what the challenges have been, what the failures have been, et cetera. So we're gonna kick this off here with the top 10% discussion, guys. Excited to be here with Randy Barker, founder, co-founder, and CEO of Intent, and then Mike DeCamp, the CEO of CoverCress. Good afternoon, guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Good to see you, Matt.
Good to be here.
All right, so think about audience questions as we're going through this. I think what we're gonna do is just kind of let Randy and Mike talk a little bit about their journeys, their learnings, and kick things off. I really would like this to be interactive. It's really about what questions do you have? What do you want to learn from them, the trials and the tribulations? And I know both individuals and both companies just from prior relationship, working experiences, et cetera, and they both came from big companies. So my first question is, start with you, Randy. How did this all happen? Moving from big Monsanto to saying, I'm gonna start a company.
You know, it was just inspiration of actually working at Monsanto, and as I go through my materials, it'll become more evident, but you know, it was just this driven curiosity to make progress and ultimately help farmers make progress with their business. And you know, opportunity at Monsanto was a great opportunity to touch the whole world doing that. And I certainly wondered myself, can I apply that to a new company to fill some of the gap that bigger companies left? So that's how we started Intent.
That's great.
Yeah, mine wasn't as direct as Randy's. So, when I left Monsanto, I actually started a small advisory group, which we were representing different players in agriculture. That led me to a client that was a private equity group that was invested in vertically integrated production ag systems. Got to see quite a variety of production ag types of systems outside of corn and soybeans, so that was a great experience. And then I retired from that group, and it's part of the network, right? So, Randy's a founder of Intent, Dennis Plummer, Mike Roth, VJ were founders of CoverCress, Arba Genetics at the time, and Dennis was an old boss of mine, and so, that ultimately led to the connection and the opportunity to join back up. But I think for me, Matt, it was about leaving the safety net of a corporation, right? All the benefits, all the certainty, all the opportunities to still move around in your career, but you had the same paycheck. You didn't have to worry about putting your family at risk. But once you sort of make that move, and Randy, I'm sure you felt the same way, once you escape and you realize you can, kill what your family needs to eat, it's pretty liberating and allows you to start to take more risks because you see the world a little differently.
No, that's great. And I'll share with the audience here, just in our times interacting, it's kind of interesting sometimes to reflect just as a person, where do you fall in the entrepreneurial range? So I'll share a story about Randy. I got to work with Randy. Randy was one of those guys, individuals that when you needed a strategy reset or business was down, and I won't go into all the particulars, but Randy was one of those top 5 people that the company would call on to figure out how do we do this. Very entrepreneurial, figure it out, launching global products across seed treatment, et cetera. Mike, also the same thing. You think about your experience in strategy, growing, acquiring, doing deals, et cetera. So it's kind of interesting. Just a little side note, I also left Monsanto for a small startup company, and my personal reflection was, well, what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is I end up having 4 or 5 jobs the next 10 or 15 years, and I meet more people and have more experiences. Right. But, that's just something that every individual has to ask themselves on the journey a little bit.
I agree.
Well, Randy, why don't you take us away with a little bit of your journey with Intent here to start us off?
Perfect. So I made pictures to tell the story. So I remember most of it. And, I think if I think about, where I came from that got me here is start anywhere, right? And, starting is Alberta, Canada for me, in the middle, farm family, multi-generation, from Alberta to Manitoba. So it was always part of it. And for me, it was really recognize that, farmers are busy. And I think that resonates, that they're still busy, if not busier today than they were. And I think another part that resonates, so as I go through this, what we're doing today, I've never forgot that, is they're busy. And if you're family, they might not have time for you. So, I mean, if you're not from their family, what hope might you have? You better be good. So that stuck with me for sure. Farming is a practical, tangible business, right? We're growing grain, selling cattle. We're always dealing in the physical. And I think that's just something that always can't be lost as well. And then ultimately, just sort of a funny story as I thought I was getting smart. So that bright guy on the horse is me. So that tells you how my risk tolerance is, or judgment. It's not great, but it is daring. So, as I ventured out, I was the youngest in the family, so I get to go get a job, and thought I'd come back farming, but maybe that's too risky for me. I got into industry and really loved it. And as I learned more and, went to university and working in the industry, it was interesting as trust with my family was going down. They were perhaps the most skeptical of anything that I would learn. They're like, I'm not sure that's going to work. I'm like, my God, I have hundreds, thousands of farmers in ag retail following my ideas. But, your own family is marginal on whether that's a good idea, because it really probably won't work here. So if you think about that, that is like in me. I'm like, my gosh, trust is hard to build. And, just for context, convincing your own family to adopt something is a challenge. And just, I know, Matt works in the family, it's up the ladder. And that was something that still sticks in my mind, is that you have multi-generation farmers working as families. Just because it's a great idea doesn't mean it's being adopted. So that's impacted me as I went through the journey. Dive in. So this is my, part of getting an opportunity working in ag retail in Canada and Monsanto Canada, and being able to come to St. Louis. And I got to spend a decade with Monsanto doing multiple global roles that Matt referred to. And you get to go everywhere. I mean, I worked in over 30 countries directly with farmers, and the stuff that got in my brain, both from being abroad and with such a brilliant group of people, really just was amazing to me and still is. So huge gratitude for that. And you realize that, well, I'm only going to, the top 10%, I'm going to be the bottom 1% of the people that I've got to meet and what they know. So it's like, stay curious. There's so much to the well. I've given up hoping that I get beyond 1%, right? But I'm happy to know it's true. So, I had the greatest job ever in Monsanto. My last one was global customer experience, which entailed working with ag retailers, farmers, and visiting all these countries to see how they do it. And, so what do you do when you have the best thing that you could imagine? You leave, right? So I left, and this is one of my wife's family's favorite sayings that I use: don't let the turkeys get you down. So I jumped to a startup, and it was funded by a whole bunch of people from the cell phone industry, and they were going to change adoption in agriculture. So I was like, okay, I'm open to most things. And what I found out is that they were mostly wrong. So I became the skeptic. They were out of business within just over a year. And, I started to go back, okay, now what? Now what is go with what I know, right? What have I learned? What have I gained from industry? What's in me that I believe? And, don't let the turkeys get you down. You can see me back with the broken shovel. That's how it felt, right? I have a great job. I'm going to a startup. I am laid off. I am out of work. And, you go back to what you know, and I'm an agronomist. So that was funny, and just shows how long it was since I was an agronomist with the broken shovel. It snapped off, needed a new one. So it was good times. We started Intent, simple concept, and it was about accelerating adoption of ag tech at the time. And, what I learned is over that period is, things changed over 8 years. We're in year 8 of running the business is, you can change the name, right? We spell it now phonetically and everyone can understand how to say it. That's important. But don't get too worried about what you have done, just worry about what you do next. And I think, innovation realizes that evolution of where we're focused. And, same thing is if we can really get the best stuff to farmers, the farmers win, the ecosystem win, the startups win, the multinationals win. Best stuff to the farm, best use is where we need to be. So, it's easy to be passionate about that. Farmers and networks, we talked about this, and the network from the St. Louis community, Monsanto, globally, every day I run across someone that I am 1 degree of separation from, and that is, globally, and that's a real advantage of being, background, St. Louis, Monsanto. It's such a great network, and the farmers that we've built off are everything. And you can see what it means to be an entrepreneur is Southwest First Class, which is that seat that you get to really enjoy. So that is different from moving from corporate traveling business class to, hey, this is my money, and if I get to board like 8-3, I can get that seat. So it's good stuff. So how this impact the business is farmer trials. So farmers are so critical and networks are so important. One of the first things we did was started up a farmer trials network, which is how do we find farmers who interested in adopting innovation and trying stuff? And that's, we moved away from intent, which was a little more ethereal, to the completely obvious branding. What are we going to call this? Farmer trials. So they can join in and participate in trials. And it's been the backbone continues to be of our company. Team is everything, right? So you can have the great network of farmers from our Farmer Trials Network, but we have to be out there and being in the field and being gritty is fantastic. And it's really, that's where most of the best ideas come from. I think most of the best ideas are, probably, it's in here, or someone I talk to, maybe here, and then I find out what a horrible idea it is on a farm. And it's like, well, let's retool that. So being there, you can't beat it. We have an internal saying is, it's a lot like a trial. And this it became a joke because as we wanted to focus on adopting technology and driving that we became the leader on-farm trials, market leader. And it's like, well, that wasn't our plan. But if you're going to get to be a market leader in something that didn't exist, take it. And so everything became a lot like a trial. And I think Regen and agriculture and what we're doing was really about working with farmers. What's the barrier to adoption of a product or practice? And measure the heck out of it, right? So even what we're talking about today in Regen and driving change it is a lot like a trial. And it's all about measuring and being in the field, and that accuracy of what's measured is absolutely critical. So where'd that drive us? Well, we became software, a software and technology company. And once again, we built a piece of software called Envision Trials that allows all the stakeholders involved in testing technology to work together. And CoverCress is a great customer of ours and has been there. Mike referenced before we started, when we first met, and it was during COVID, 3 or 4 of us in a Helix Center in a CoverCress office with tape across the floor, everyone seated 8 feet apart. But we talked about their vision, and we're still working together today. And they guided what we built, and farmers guide what we built. So I'm excited about that software because it really reduces the friction of farmers and retailers and stakeholders and companies working together to see what's really happening. Embrace technology even if it doesn't look like it. So, it comes in so many ways, and I think people always think about in-plant science or software, and sometimes it's a monitor. Sometimes it's like, how did that guy get the paint on those hay bales? That's a zero-till planting or into cover crop. So everything is technology. It's just how do we extract it, make it simple? So, I mean, it's an absolute curiosity to me. Every farm is so different. I've found them infinitely intriguing, and I look at it as our job, collectively as companies and as our company to really understand it, not allow them to be like we are, sovereign individuals, sovereign businesses. Listen to them and bring them detail that they didn't know about. Market models, this is where we're at now. So, we're on the farm, we have farmers in our network, we have software that's collecting data. Well, now we're into the modeling space. And, what do you do with all that data? Well, our companies who we serve, they want to know, where do I go next? Where should I place my product? What do you do with all this trial data? Well, this is what we start to do, is start to deploy it on behalf of the companies. And those innovators really benefit because you're building a placement model for a new idea that's never been tested. Where's that most likely to fit? So that is really interesting. We're tackling product placement, sustainability impacts, right? What's our projected GHG? What's the impact? And it's been really fascinating. It's our next wave. So we call the intent advantage. We've built so many things off what I would say the collective idea of our farmers, our customers, and it keeps going. So we built Envision. We're launching a new software that drives the modeling approach, which is ANOVA. We underpin it with an infrastructure of Apogee that deals with all the geospatial data, lets the clients manage it the way they want, and our farmer trials, as I said in the beginning, is the backbone. And those two softwares, our farmers let us tackle Regen, right? Because once again, if they're not adopting a product or practice, we're really in trouble. And I go back to the great farmer panel this morning is, this is an economic decision, stupid, right? This is about dollars. And we all have good ideas, but their magnitude for risk, if you look at commodity price going from $6 to $4, that's 30% of their revenue 1 year. How are you going to help them? How are you going to help them find the way to change? Listen to them. And we always say, it's always about performance, right? If I'm asking you to do something different, how's it perform? What's their perception of the experience? So not only does it work, but how is my experience as a farmer changing? Like, what's the friction point? And then certainly it's all other factors, which usually comes down to economics, weather, climate, regulatory, right? Where the rubber meets the road. And I think in that is back to the original point of this is about accelerating adoption, which means how do you get innovation happening, regenerative progress? People have to change. Farmers have to change. But, asking someone to change when they're on the edge of business success is an inappropriate thing for us to do as an industry. And I think if we're going to ask the right thing is, how do we make that less painful? How do we get the economics to the right place? How do we make it less burdensome? We need to remove the pain from the farmer experience to really see Regen take off. And I think it was also, I'll give Vijay great credit for teeing that up. It's like our global goals for climate impact and net zero, they aren't their goals. Now, doesn't mean we can't build the bridge, but if we expect them to build the bridge and drive across, I think we're in the wrong place. So I'm excited that that's where we start. This is what intent does. This is my passion that we can get it right. I go back to where I came from. If you're going to build trust from their base, meet their goals. And if we meet their goals and help them move to become multi-generational, pass it on to their family, build better soils, help them create more economic stability, it's hands down. Has worked every time, and I think Matt helps our organization as being a director with intent, and he said, how many acres have you guys impacted on positive launches, right? I said, I don't know. But since then, I've been working on it, and it's It's north of 50 million acres we've reached just through our work. And you go, well, you're on 50 million acres? No, the things we've touched, listening to farmers, being detailed in the process of measure, it's continuing to grow because the companies carry on that reach. So it's just a real honor to do that. And my final thought, what have I learned, which was somewhat of the questions, is, it's persevere, right? Blind ignorance. Starting where I started is like, who wants to get on a wild horse? Maybe dumb people, right? But you persevere. Gratitude for the networks, gratitude for the ecosystem, embrace it, foster it, but have courage, because what I would also say is, you have to have some blind ignorance of big goals. So I'm not hard on the corporates with net zero. I'm saying let's go for it, but there is work to do to get there, and I think that is courage on both sides. Enjoy it, which is really great. This picture of my wife that's in the audience and has carried the day through all this nut show that's been starting a company, the ups and downs, but it's really enjoyable. And we call, she refers to the vast majority of our team as our kids, and that's what they are. They're our investment in the industry and in the community. And then I think the other part is give back. What can we do if we're in the final 10%, or how do we get to the 1% to keep pouring back into our community? Because for us, back to the original point of this coalition is, St. Louis is the best place for this. Maybe we're proof positive that it is central, it is the network, it is the resource, it is the community, it is centrally located to agriculture. We work in Canada, the US, and Brazil, and I'm so committed to it. It's, I don't know, maybe we'll change our logo to have a little arch on it, but yeah, big fan, and that's definitely my story of intent, and hopefully I hit the homework task that was requested.
Well, I tell you what, that was a great kickoff for this session. And literally this conversation Randy referenced, it was last week, and we were talking to think about 8 or 9 years ago, Randy and his co-founder started Intent. You heard the number that I hadn't heard in terms of the acres. He's built a portfolio of customers that are billion-dollar multinational customers and companies like the one that I happen to work at, which is a startup here in Bridge Park a few years ago. And it's just an absolutely amazing story. We're going to come back and probe more on it, but I do have one question before we go to Mike. You said, do what you know. Was there a moment how did you decide that this is the model for Intent, or this is the place that I know? Was there one of those defining moments with you and Kevin, or did it just kind of evolve from that first experience that you had in the first startup?
I think, no, it came from my time at Monsanto and this goal in my brain of how does all this rich R&D and product advancement tie to farmer experience? And I don't think the bridge was ever fully built. Yeah. We worked like heck at it, but it's how do we close that? Because if we can solve that comfort level back to the farmer, where it came from was there, and earliest beginnings of, families a bit skeptical on advice. So as I became wiser, at least in my own brain, I realized how sensitive trust was to adoption. And, it still befuddles me is, hey, it's not an easy wand waver, but it can be done. And it's, that was the aha moment, is what needs to be done. And the failed startup, wouldn't pursue that. I was convinced it was the way. I'm still convinced, and at least I have some proof, so I don't feel so. At least we have lots of people with us on that ride, so I'm very proud of that.
You bet, that's great. Well, let's transition, Mike, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey with CoverCress?
Sure. I don't have any slides, so Randy outdid me on his homework for sure. So I mentioned earlier, right, I want to make sure, give credit where credit's due, that, this was an idea that, Dennis Plummer, Mike Roth, VJ had 10 years ago now, over 10 years ago, it's pretty amazing. There's a need, we all realize that greenhouse gases are impacting our climate, right? I mean, we can all talk about climate change and have different views, different opinions there. But at the end of the day, that the impact that actually fossil fuels used in for transportation purposes, they impact the environment. And so the question is, how can we do something to alleviate that impact? And the idea for CoverCress, right, was that, hey, there's an opportunity for another oilseed feedstock to be used to create these renewable fuels. Soybeans work great. Soybeans are a wonderful feedstock for renewable diesel, for sustainable aviation fuel, for these biofuels that are going to help to lower greenhouse gas emissions. But soybeans have a lot of other uses as well. They're very important to our food system. They're very important to our feed system. And so if people remember, and the guys here in the panel for sure remember, because we were all at Monsanto at the same time during this time frame, when we saw Monsanto's share price shoot well past $100 a share, all because there was so much demand for ethanol. And everybody thought, okay, there's going to be no more soybean acres, it's going to be all corn acres. And we made a lot of money selling corn, Monsanto did. But that had a lot of people concerned, and rightfully so, right? Again, now you're in this debate about how do we balance the need for feeding ourselves, feeding our protein, and also providing for fuel, this debate. And so the USDA, really, this is where this idea started. The USDA sat down and started thinking about what are some alternative crops that could be used as a potential feedstock source to make biofuels. And that's where it started. The godfather of pennycress, I'm looking at Tim Almosoff. I'm not saying he's the godfather of pennycress, but he knows who I'm talking about with Terry Isbell. Terry Isbell at the USDA station in Peoria quickly identified pennycress as a great opportunity. So pennycress is a winter crop. Pennycress has a very high oil content. Pennycress is right between soybeans and canola. So soybeans at 20%, we're at 30%, canola is at 40%. But what it does, it grows in the winter, right? We don't need to compete with acres that are being grown for corn or being grown for soybeans. We can come into a window when ground was usually fallow and get on that acre, produce a new feedstock source to be used to make these biofuels. And because we grow in the winter, we get a very low carbon intensity score, which translates into a lot of value in the soil when it's being used, particularly in markets that have mandated systems like California with their low carbon fuel standards. So that was the idea. And what's interesting, right, Randy, you went through a little bit about some of the changes you've made as you've learned about your business. And when I think about everything I know from the early days to CoverCress, from CoverCress to where we are today, yes, there's been a lot of things that have occurred, a lot of things we never anticipated, but the focus of the company has never changed. It's pretty interesting, right? It's all been about how do we use science, in our case, breeding and gene editing, to take this crop, this weed that grows in the wintertime, domesticate it into something that would be valuable, not only as that feedstock source for fuels, but I really like your word there, the bridge, right? This bridge to how do you create value for that farmer who is the one that's really producing that value and that carbon, creating the crop for us to participate in that value stream. So that's where we've been focused. When I joined CoverCress, so my background, again, I don't come from a farm. I don't have any cool pictures of me getting bucked on a horse. I'm a city guy, St. Louis, background in accounting and law. I joined Monsanto when the ag company went public, was in the law group. I made a switch out of law into strategy. We started a business unit inside of Monsanto that Matt referenced, American Seeds, and that set me on a path into agriculture at probably 3 or 4 years into my career at Monsanto, and an opportunity to, once we got past the formulation of the business, making several acquisitions, to have an operating role where I ran marketing and seed sales for one of our divisions. And when you think about that path and that path for that farmer, and as I got to know the business more, it always surprised me whether it's Monsanto, Bayer today, Corteva, Syngenta, any of the big multinationals, how much risk we really were able to always put off onto the farmer, right? I mean, that farmer is making that decision, set aside all the other decisions they're making when they're buying equipment from Deere and all those things, but we're asking them to spend this big chunk of their wallet on these inputs that they're gonna put into the ground and hope that there's gonna be a crop. And then, if there is a crop, that they can hope that there's a market that's gonna pay them a value that makes that investment worthwhile. When I was in strategy, I pushed ideas about how we could do risk share. And one really great example of how that ended up not working out well for the farmer, and it didn't work out well for Monsanto either, was a product that we developed in soybeans, had high oleic properties, really in demand, or we believed it was in demand by the food companies for low-sat products, Vista soybeans. We promised it would be on 5 million acres. It was on 5 million acres. It was a GMO. Whenever you transform germplasm, it's never the best germplasm in the early days, so it didn't yield on par with the other soybeans they were planting. And then, right, we were done. We had sold our Vista, and then they were left to see if there was a market there or not for that product, and there wasn't. So when I sat down the first time and I spent time talking to a lot of my former colleagues that was really exciting to be joining back up with, Tim and Mark Mesmer and Jerry Steiner, I asked them all the question, how is this different from Vista, right? That's what I was really concerned about. And that's been the key and the focus, and I give Dennis and Jerry a lot of credit for having that focus early on, that we are a closed loop system, right? This is about partnering with a grower, giving that grower an opportunity to plant covercress, to get paid well for covercress, but not have the risk of the market making, that we had to be in a spot to develop that market. And so, that's been the focus and the journey all along. How can we go from what we're good at covercress, product development? We're phenomenal at it. When I joined, I made the assumption that we were outsourcing a lot of our science to Monsanto. Monsanto was an investor, but we weren't, right? We had arguably the world's greatest corn breeder ever, and Mark Mesmer, that joined us outside after he retired. We were lucky enough to bring in Tim Olmosoff, again, took a risk and left his career at Monsanto, tremendous science background in editing and in oil seeds, to start a gene editing program. And what we do today is, it's hard for anybody to really, I think, say that they're better at what we do on the science side. So we're very good at that piece. We've done an excellent job of figuring out how do we get farmers excited about being a covercress grower. And we've always known that we have to make this something that's not just an economic opportunity, which is obviously very valuable, but it has to be meaningful to that grower. It has to fit within their system. And so, that was part of our early conversations with Randy, as we were starting to think about our commercialization, how we were going to attract farmers, how we were going to put trial programs in place to get farmers comfortable with planting covercress, learning the new agronomic practices. We spent a lot of time on that, and I'd say we're very good at that. But we also have this other aspect of our business, right? Generating that downstream demand. So at the end of the day, the value going to somebody who's going to take our oil and is going to make renewable diesel. Well, Randy, if somebody on your board said, hey, Randy, you want to spend $300 million on building some kind of a big capital investment, you probably say, well, I'm not sure, that's not the best use of your capital. And for us, that meant crush, right? We either were going to become vertically integrated and have our own crush capacity, which would take hundreds of millions of dollars to have, or we were going to have to partner. So there's a risk, right? Now we've spent all this time developing this product. We've gotten farmers really excited. We can bring it to somebody who can crush it and to turn it into the meal and the oil components so we can get the oil to that customer. But how are we going to continue to stay attached to the value of the oil was the question. And so that was a very purposeful and very strategic North Star for us. We couldn't let go of that. And we had a opportunity to bring in Bunge as an investor, obviously a big soybean crusher. We also brought in a group called Renewable Energy Group, who at that time was probably the only pure play renewable diesel producer in the world. And, we had a group of investors that thought, why, right? Why am I being diluted to bring in 2 more strategic? Again, not the norm for a startup, right? Startups usually have 1 strategic, and that strategic is invested because they want to have the opportunity to make a decision about whether they're going to bring that technology in-house. We really argued that it was incredibly important strategically for the company to have these other partners, that since we were running this closed loop value chain, we needed people that were invested on all 3 points, on the seed side, the farmer side, and the midstream with crush, and the downstream with fuel production. And fortuitously, it worked out well for us, right? It's sometimes in business and startups, being lucky really helps. And I'm a big fan of how I built this. And if you watch that podcast, that's the last question that Guy Raz always asks everybody. How much of your success do you attribute to skill? How much do you attribute to luck? And luck plays a factor. And so what happened for us was that Bunge and Chevron decided this space in terms of, and I'll put this in the context of regenerative ag, because that's really where it fits and it's appropriate for this conference, that they needed to partner together to make sure that they had access going back upstream. And so there's a $600 million joint venture that Bunge and Chevron entered into. That led to a conversation with us about crush and something very novel, right? It's never been done with any of the big ABCDs. I don't know if, is Nanda here? Nanda didn't join. So if everybody knows Nanda Kumar, Bunge Ventures, very talented man, Nanda understood that in order to make this work for us, and we needed to have some opportunity to share in the value after the crush gate. And so that's really what drove the opportunity for us, was this enter into an agreement with Bunge and Chevron. It's today known as BCAR, I believe is the acronym. Bunge Chevron Ag Renewables, I think, is the name of the entity, to where we deliver covercress to a crush facility that Bunge operates, or the Bunge is put into this JV, and we get paid for the grain, but then we have an opportunity, based on Bunge's efforts to sell the oil and the meal, if they can make a margin beyond what is reasonable for them, we get to share in that. So that gives us the opportunity to have this value stream, and it becomes the bridge that Randy talked about. That's how the farmer is going to participate in what he's done in planting covercress under contract to this value that gets created when somebody's putting renewable diesel in their tank in California. That allows that value to come back to the farmer. And I know you got some questions about watchouts, so I got a little story to tell there, but I think the really important thing where my head is focused these days, 3 years ago, what's your biggest worry? My biggest worry would have been farmer adoption, right? We are doing a phenomenal job on farmer adoption. We have partners like Intent and others that have helped us to be able to develop programs where we can get farmers comfortable with covercress before they contract with us and are actually producing a crop that they're going to get paid on. And the interest level has been just tremendous, and we're really excited about that. We have other issues, and I'll talk about that there. But when Matt asked the question, but where my focus is today is, again, going back to this overall thesis that goes back to Terry Isbell and the USDA. If we're going to have cleaner burning fuels, and if cleaner burning fuels are going to be derived from bioproducts like crops, it's going to take that whole chain to work together, right? We can't do things anymore in silos. It can't be about the seed sale if you're a seed company. It can't be about the crush margin if you're the crusher, and it can't be about the retail price of RD if you're the producer of that product. Everybody has to invest in this system, and that's what makes where we sit today in covercress very unique, by having all 3 of those players that represent those chains, those parts of our supply chain, on our cap table. So I'll pause there, but that's where we are. Matt mentioned it, where we are. We still have work to do, but I am very happy to report we do have our first commercial crop in the ground. We will harvest that crop in May and early June. It's not going to crush yet because Bunge's not ready for us, but it's going in as an ingredient in chicken feed. So we will earn our first dollar, sometime later this year. We're very excited about that. We've proven the commercial model. Thank you. It's still not necessarily profitable, but it works. And so it's a start. And, as you think about how we can utilize the resources of a Bayer, a Bunge, and a Chevron to now take that model and scale it and make improvements, I feel real confident about the future.
It's a great sharing here, and just amazing when you think about, if you look back 4 or 5 years ago, to think that you're part of a group that has Big Ag, Bayer, Chevron, and Bunge all working together for the common goal. Question that I'll pose to both of you. So Mike, you've been at CoverCress a little over 4 years or so now. What are the conversations like with those partners in kind of the regen sustainability space? Are there differences now as people are, has it changed at all? Are those partners and farmers starting to look at CoverCress differently, or is there, just talk a little bit about, has there been an evolution or change in the last 4 years? And then I'd pitch it to Randy, because over the last 8 years in your customer base, I'm just interested in understanding, what changes are you seeing with customers saying, I need to look at this and that related to regen versus maybe just, quote, traditional product performance? I'd like to see how those conversations are changing.
Yeah, if you think about the aspect of the farmer, I think that's been the biggest shift that I've seen. That, everybody in this room understands this, and Randy talked about trust, right? Farmers only get an opportunity to do what they do, 30, 40 times in a lifetime if they're lucky, right? And so, taking risk, which they take a tremendous amount of risk every day in their operations, but they're very careful about it. And so when something new and exciting like CoverCress comes along, and the promise of a new cash stream and the third cash stream and what used to be just a 2 cash stream system, that all sounds great, but they're smart, right? They're like, okay, what are all the things I need to worry about that are associated with that? So, we early on were really focused on the cover crop aspect of who we were, and we made a shift there because, farmers are adopting cover crops, but slowly, right? They're skeptical. It's a cost to plant a cover crop. They don't get to sell that cover crop. They get the long-term benefit. It's an investment they're making for the long-term benefit of better yields, but they're still not going to take that risk right off the bat. So we helped our story in the idea of CoverCress helps to ease that risk a little bit for them. But it wasn't until they had the opportunity to say, wait, you're not telling me you want to sell me CoverCress today or right now or ever. What you're telling me is you want me to work with this for a while, and I'm going to get an opportunity to do this and get the benefit of a cover crop at no cost to me. Yep, that's right. And at some point, if I decide I want a contract with you, we're going to have a contract. It's going to be, the price is going to be, set in essence. It might vary based on commodity prices, but I don't have to worry about taking this product and moving it downstream. Nope, that's not your problem, right? You have the opportunity to get paid. It's interesting, the conversation shifted, and so when we have our farmer meetings, it's less of, we talk a lot about agronomics, but there is a lot of conversations about the regenerative aspects of CoverCress and as a cover crop, right? Those pieces. So the farmer mindset has shifted somewhat, I think, because we've allowed them to come along with us on the journey, and I think that's the. I think the downstream players, right, this has been really important. I think there's maybe been a shift a little bit the other way, right? ESG doesn't have all the shine on it that it used to have, I think, and now it's getting down to the brass tacks, what really can be done, right? SAF is really important, but at the end of the day, the amount of SAF that would have to be produced to even meet any of the goals that are set for 2050 to lower greenhouse gas emissions and for our air transportation are so massive, right? That it's a bit of lip service, I would say. And we've talked to United, we've talked to American, all of that. I think it's more, the fuel companies that can really say, hey, this is an investment we're making. It's an opportunity. It's very straightforward. We can decarbonize our transportation fuels for trucking, for rail, for other things, in a way that can be done meaningfully through these alternative feedstocks. So there's been, I'd say, farmers are moving towards it, and the industry is taking a more pragmatic view.
That makes sense. I would say, back to the farmer panel earlier today, the cool thing about what CoverCrest is doing, you're introducing your competitors, the non-cover crop acre. That's a great space to be. Farmers want it to work. Assuming the economics all line up, it's going to be wildly successful. I'll share a little story here. About a year ago, my brother and I were invited to bid on a farm that was coming up for rent. It was a large tract that went to 3 heirs, and part of the proposal was what the cover crop management plan was going to be from the farmers. And then that's what those heirs were inquiring, equally, if not more, than what the economics were going to be of the proposed rent arrangements as you went through the process. So not only at the farmer level, as you have more non-farmer owned land, and that's going to continue to become important as well. Kind of an interesting scenario. I'd like to ask the audience to think about questions you got. Raise your hand, and we'll either just handle it live, or Dan will come around with a microphone. We'd love to engage you with your questions. Randy, tell us a little bit about how have the conversations changed with you and your customers the last 8 years related to regen and sustainability?
Yeah, it's completely, it's shifted. So ironically, one of the first things we ever worked on, first customer, was reduced rate, variable rate fungicide application, which go, okay, that's beneficial, right? So, however, it's now we're with the partners, with our customers, we're pushing the envelope, and it's like, okay, we're not going to just test for performance to get the product placed. Conveniently, it's a lot like a trial. We're measuring all this stuff. Why don't we look about its regenerative impact as an improved practice, right? So it's not just a product, but now it's also a practice. So CoverCrest, great example, is we're doing something different. And I think every customer that we're speaking to, if they're not bringing it up, we're bringing it up. And then within that, we now have customers from sustainable aviation fuel, new crops, new placement, and these things really rely on, in terms of measuring, working with farmers, the adoption matrix, as I call it, but also, where do we go? It's a big planet, and that's where projecting and placement really becomes important of where do these practices take us as a regenerative community. So it's all the time, which is good, and if they don't bring it up, we do. Because I'm like, in 3 years, if you don't have the data, if you don't have the information, you're really going to be disappointed that you didn't capture that so that you could make the claim about your regenerative or sustainability impact.
And you're also seeing, Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, but your customer base, it's not just traditional, I'll call it ag input companies now. You're moving up to food companies and others.
Yeah, it's really interesting, as I said, renewable fuels, alternative crops, improvements in practices as it impacts that offtake. And, we're seeing, without getting too technical, you go from carbon credits and sequestration to carbon intensity scores and indexes, which is more in that offtake and measuring stuff, but that's where we still need those things. And it's really thoughtful to do that. I think, from our simple world of adoption and technology is, I've never regretted one day collecting too much data that we're really using now. So the things we're able to do in terms of modeling projection had to do with the first year we were in business was cracking the code on precision ag data, records, information. Those are investments in data now that will serve us in the regenerative sustainability space 3 years from now, 2 years from now.
Excellent. Well, if you have any questions from the audience, raise your hand. Dan's on the side. Looks like we've got one right up front.
I can talk quite loud.
Go for it.
So the two of you have the benefit of a lot of gray hair and a lot of experience, in a good way, a lot of experience. You came out of corporate, you, for better or worse, maybe learned from what didn't work as well as what worked. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with farmers and their 30 to 40 shots on goal? And how does trust play in from learning from what doesn't work? How do you manage that, learn from that, balance that, benefit from that? What's that look like?
I'll take a shot. I would say that there's a lot of big ones, and a lot of them were experienced corporately that stuck with me. So I won't go into what those particular failures are, but they were of significant magnitude and important strategically to the company. But what struck me was you realize how much detail in the customer experience that you should have planned when the crisis happens, right? And you go, as I think about the biggest failures or things that, once again, sort of like background stick with me was, man, it would have been so easy if we just mapped out what we needed to be tracking, measuring, and asking the farms and monitoring every week. Because when the proverbial stuff hits the fan, that's when everyone's scrambling and said, man, I wish we knew what, right? And you're looking for data. So I think that, I have many of those failures, but those ones just stuck with me as, just a little bit of thought and mapping out a farmer experience, knowing that they're doing something new, seems so easy to do ahead of time. And the lift would be economically to get it right. It's investing. If you invested $2 million more, you wouldn't have lost the $300 million. Seems like an easy decision. So it's just that simple forethought that farmers aren't changing that quickly. They're kind of like soil, right? It's not like they caught me off guard with this whole planting, right? We know they're going to do it. So I'm very practical in that, and that's what I've learned.
Yeah, I think, for somebody who didn't grow up on the farm and who came into it later in career, what I learned about growers, and I think it's a shame that people don't understand that. I mean, particularly if you're enamored with business like I am, I've never met a group of people that are better business people in my life, right? I mentioned earlier, right, the decisions they're making with all the money they have to make for their inputs, the hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars they're making on equipment, right? They are having to take that risk and figure out how to hedge it, right? So they're playing in the futures markets. They run a business, so they have to do all the accounting, they have to do all the HR, right? They have migrant labor, so they have to deal with immigration laws. They run these very complex organizations, but what really struck me, and again, I had no concept of this until, particularly coming from a law background where everything was about making sure everything was documented properly, everybody signed off on it, and the deal was done, that if you shake a farmer's hand, that's your deal, right? And I think that's still true today. Not that you have to have contracts, right? We have contracts with farmers. Randy, I'm sure, has contracts with farmers. Farmers want to know what they're going to receive, be protected. But you can come to an agreement with them, on a handshake and document that later. But if you can get that trust, but if you lose it, you're never going to get it back. So, just being honest and open with them is really important. When I had my first farmer meeting, it was in Ohio. I was way beyond my ski tips from my experience. I was going to get up and talk about corn seed and soybean seed to a group of farmers, and I was really nervous. And so to sort of ease into it, my first comment was to apologize to them that they had to be listening to an accountant and a lawyer. And then I kind of did my spiel, and I don't even know what I said because I think I was so nervous that day. I had this farmer come up to me afterwards, and he said, Mike, do you mind if I give you some advice? I said, sure, I'd appreciate it. It's like, don't ever apologize. It's like, we're here to learn. You have a perspective that you bring. And so it just showed me the mindset of a farmer. They're so willing to be educated. They're so willing to have a conversation. They just want to be treated fairly and honestly and transparently. And and they're willing to hear the bad news. There's times
Yeah.
when there just is gonna be bad news. We had a big launch planned for Covercrest that we sort of had to scale back for regulatory reasons. We had to go to our growers and kind of pull back on some contracts. We were open, we're honest with them. We didn't make it their problem. We accepted the problem, and we didn't lose any relationship credibility as a result of that.
I would add a must-know that's just been fascinating from our work is that the experience, farmer experience, relative performance is as good a predictor of adoption, right? How that relationship evolves and what the trust is if they believe in the mission, right? Could be a product or practice. They don't quit at the first time if they know you're committed. If you're fly-by-night, you better have great product performance. And even then, it's probably a no-go. So I think that experience and relationship is so key.
Randy, could you pressure test an impression I've developed over the last 20, 30 years dealing with startups, particularly those that have new products, biologicals, RNAi, you name it. It seems to me, and I want to know if you've seen the same thing, it seems to me that everyone out there, and that's an exaggeration, but damn near everyone out there with an invention who started a company is out to change the world with that product alone. And I can't tell you how many times I said to people, where in your plans are you testing your product in combination with other products to see if there are synergies or if they fit better or there are opportunities? And I would say 99 times out of 100, the answer, they look at me with a dull stare like, no, I'm going to change agriculture with my biological, or I'm going to change and everybody going solo. Now, you've tested a lot, worked with a lot of these players. Is there more willingness of that going on than I have the impression? Because they're pitching me to invest. So maybe they don't want to admit that their product isn't everything.
I think, man, that's a loaded question. So I am in the boat, yeah. I think you're spot on. And what I've learned, recently, I had to deprogram from becoming a product-oriented guy, right, in a large company. But once you get back into the agronomy, you go, well, contextually, nothing is a silver bullet. It's part of a system. Farmers bluntly say, yeah, no kidding. I don't do one thing. I do many things to produce a crop, and that's one thing. We found the same thing in testing trials. People go, well, if you just measured this, there's a panacea. It's not just measuring yield. It's not just the soil test. It's always an array. It's always a system effect, and that is with certainty. And so I do think, there's a big gap in that systems thinking and willingness to partner. And then I was complaining perhaps a bit to Mike, I guess is the best description is, not every product or invention is a company. And you said, well, what if there is great innovation that was a complement? What if we were stacking? What if we were licensing and being a little more open architecture? And both on the software side, both on the early innovation, what if you got that? What are the opportunities? Because I think we're in an environment, whether it's VC funding or even corporate funding, everyone's saying, hey, a little more efficiency is going to go a long way. So I'm very much down that path with you, that we're missing a lot by not more companies necessarily get it done, but certainly collaboration and systems approach will probably end up massively better for all the inventors and the farmers.
So Randy, another question for you. So this morning we sort of mentioned briefly that the pharmaceutical industry, the biotech industry obviously has a development process. It's regulated, it's preclinical trials, clinical trials. And there is a set of organizations called clinical trials organizations that obviously run preclinical and clinical trials for pharma biotech companies. Not that they don't do it in-house, but they also outsource a lot of it. Is the intent of farmer trials to go in a similar direction to maybe help standardize and help both startups and established companies bring products to market And you know, the other things that happens in clinical trials sometimes is that obviously physicians who participate in them get paid for it.
Yeah.
The patients frequently do not. They do in phase 1 because they're volunteers. Later stages, they're not. Regulatory issues here, you could obviously pay farmers for sort of changing their methods or growing a certain crop if you're managing it and you know, bringing the data to the fore and maybe expediting it. Are you thinking about that? I mean, you're nodding your head, so obviously you're familiar with what happens in the pharma biotech sector. Is that where you're going? Is that the intent? Because it just sounds like something that's missing that could accelerate adoption if there was money brought in from people who want to bring their products and get them adopted to pay for those trials and maybe use your organization to sort of manage it.
Yeah, yes and yes. So there's, you know, we started the farm scale trial, which is sort of that commercial implementation. So fortunately, my wife is a doctor and has advised me on all sorts of things. So this is a very convenient dinner conversation, nice addition to the thinking. So very much we would talk about, you know, okay, there's regulatory advancements in that's early stage where we will partner to get that data, but it's really in those case studies or in the world of agriculture is getting it onto a farm. So how is it going to work in the real world? Which, you know, I said good thing, you know, with plants versus humans is plants don't have agency. They're like in the ground, they stay in one spot. So we can do a lot more with data, but I think you're spot on, and we're sort of in that CRO, but also that market adoption space and partnering back in the early regulatory trials. We've had lots of success with companies earlier stage when we talk about how they're using regulated or CRO or early stage data really informs how fast you can get through that middle part to a positive farmer experience. And so tons of space to grow there, and that's definitely in our sights, and we're making progress.
I have a question for Mike.
Yes, sir.
Just been thinking about covercress, with it being literally a whole new cash crop, and there aren't that many in the world, right? You and I guess your employees and so forth trying to introduce that to a farmer who has only worked with maybe 2 cash crops in their whole lifetime. What are some of the surprises that you may have had trying to introduce something so different that from what they've been used to?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that goes back to a point I made earlier that, right, on its face, if you said to somebody, hey, you can, you know, where you used to only earn income 2 times over a growing season, you can earn 3 times. Well, that's a no-brainer, you should do it. But it's just not that easy, right? I mean, there are cultural practices, you know, Matt, you made the reference to competition, right? For guys like Matt and his brother and his part of the world in Illinois, you know, we're competing with Florida, right? I mean, that's who we're competing with because that's the cultural practice, right? You take the winter off and you don't need to deal with the crop. Now, there's other regions where farming is not as easy, where double cropping happens. And so, you know, we've seen the best adoption there where there is some familiarity with at least growing a crop in the wintertime, in this case, winter wheat. But, you know, there are 2 things, right? I mean, you're asking a farmer, if they're not already double cropping, you're asking a farmer to get their combine out at a time when they're planting their 2 most important crops, their corn and soybeans. And then vice versa, right? Later, you're asking them to get their planter out when they're combining their 2 most important crops, corn and soybeans. And so, you know, there are massive labor issues and labor shortages on the farm today that make that a real difficult proposition. So, you know, for the farmer, we have to make it, and Dale Sorensen, who many of you know is our chief commercial officer, Dale's a legend in the seed industry. You know, Dale talks about it as the easy button. We have to figure out how to make it the easy button for the grower. And that takes investment on our part, right? So, you know, whether that's what's the simplest way to do the planting so that they don't have to worry about getting their own planter out. So we do things through drone seeding. We're looking at technology where the air seeder could be put to seed, covercress could be put right on a combine. So while they're harvesting their corn, they're actually seeding their covercress at the same time. So no new trip, no new activity. On the harvest side, are there ways that we can use custom harvesting services where we can aggregate farms and go and do the harvesting through a custom operation instead of asking the farmer to do it themselves? And then there's just the logistics, right? At the end of the day, there are a couple things about our crop. We're very small seeded, so yeah, there's on-farm storage that farmers have, and maybe, and I don't know that this is true, you might think, okay, it's counter-cyclical, so there should be space, but people for marketing purposes might keep their bins full because they're not ready to sell their crop yet. But were there to be space, there would have to be some capital investments made, right? At least even just on the floors, just so cover cress wouldn't fall through the screens that are meant to keep beans and corn in place. So that's just something that is not going to help a farmer be excited about working with cover cress if they have to manage that crop after harvest. So we get that crop off their farm immediately, and so that's a cost to us, right? We have to incur the cost and logistics to move that grain off the farm quickly so they can get back to their practice. So that's but it's just an education, and it just goes back to building that trust, not pushing the farmer too quickly, having this opportunity. We call it, our farmer adoption program. It's a trial program. It's a way to say, hey, let's take 40, 80 acres and plant cover cress, right? Get experience planting it, get experience watching it through the season. You can terminate it, so you don't have to worry about the harvest aspect. You've gotten a free cover crop, so you've actually benefited your farm, and you've learned something along the way, and then we can decide in 1 or 2 years, is this something you want to do as a commercial practice or not? So it's seed to me, I've said this before, seed industry, right, a lot of new ideas come along, but there's really nothing revolutionary that's ever been done in seed since hybrid corn. It's really evolutionary, and so just building on the things we've all learned, and you've done that, I'm sure, Randy, in your business,
No,
to
you guys
just your
killed it.
experience.
Covercress has done such a good job. You go, hey, what is he talking about falling through the floor? Well, aeration for your corn and beans compared to a pennycress, which is a flat, tiny seed, it's going to go through the floor. And that was back to that original question. Think through the whole process, not just when the seed gets handed off, but go through that whole process in your mind with farmers. They're always happy to tell you, and you explain it, and they'll usually bluntly tell you, hey, have you looked at this?
Right.
And Covercress has done a really nice job of thinking about that whole farmer cycle to protect themselves from the accidents or the bad things that happen.
Back to your question of, the 30 to 40 tries and what they're doing, I've observed with both of you and your organizations, you're transparent, you're open, you provide your technology at a real world scenario, but also, and it's a detail, but it's really important, you have your early adopter farmers that you share information with. You have a set of farmers that when a company hires you, they're collaborating and sharing information and feedback. What does that mean? You're establishing a lot of trust, you're showing transparency, and then either as a farmer collaborator or a company that's engaged with intent, you're getting the real world feedback. And it goes a long way, and it carries and it multiplies really quickly. I've seen it by going out a couple of these online discussion boards where intent will come up. I got approached by intent, and they've got this trial for XYZ, and it comes back extremely positive right there. Within 24 hours, you'll see 10 responses right there. So it's a little thing, but it's really important. It's not how it's always done by all these companies, but both of these organizations and individuals realize that you have to go where the farmer's at. You have to let them trial it, how they do it in the real world. You have to be open with the information and let others share in that. So kind of a detail, but I think from where I've sat, it's very important that both of you do real well. I'm going to ask this question. So if you were to change anything or redo anything over your journey since you've been at CoverCrest and started at Intent or a Watch Out, what would that be?
Matt knows this question, knows the answer to this question. This is one I was referencing earlier. So for me, it would be, our focus on the regulatory aspects. I think, right, so much of our focus early on, rightfully so, and I'm not sure I'm saying that should have been done, please don't hear that. I just, if I had the crystal ball or the opportunity to go back in time and make a change, I would have taken the time to, alongside the work we were doing with product development, alongside the work we were doing to start to build farmer excitement. Not that we weren't focused on regulatory, but that we just would have had somebody that was living and breathing it day in, day out. I mean, there's a tremendous resource here in the 39 North community with Yelly Advisors and that group of phenomenal scientists that run this outsourcing regulatory system that many startups in this community take advantage of, and we did as well. But having somebody that is living and breathing, in our case, CoverCrest every day, which we've added that talent, Dr. Michelle Starkey, I think would allow us to be just a little bit farther ahead than maybe where we are now, right? It's easy to think, hey, well, we'll figure that out later, but regulatory can really, really slow you down. So that was sort of it's really the only thing, Matt, that when I think back, if we could have just tweaked the plan a little bit, maybe used our capital to invest in our own resource, we might have made that decision knowing what we know now.
You bet. How about you, Randy?
Well, there's a lot. But I'm also grateful for all the twists and turns. One, I was like, man, I wish I had focused a little more on the marketing and positioning, being that that's my expertise, but we were busy doing it for others. But that worked out really well. But if I thought about something that would have really changed the outcome, because it would have been being less concerned about competitive factors or making sure, we're just going to be successful before we partner or get engaged in the community and ecosystem. I think we would be further ahead. So leverage the network, people found us, and I'm thinking, man, what took us so long? Why weren't we talking to Bio St. Louis and BGV much earlier? Why weren't we set up at the Helix Center as a St. Louis company? We would have benefited enormously from being earlier, but better late than never, like most things. Probably my kind of stubbornness to make sure that we got stuff all in order before we asked for help. And I think for intent is, maybe to the startups that are in the innovative program, is asking for help is probably the smartest thing you can do to find new partnerships, and don't be afraid of collaborating and partnering early.
You've had a few things going on, so I think you've done all right, Randy. Any other questions from the audience here? Okay, if we don't have any, I'm going to talk, Randy, in your deck, you had it's all about the team. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about what key learnings or insights or reflections. I'm going to leave this real open, but building a team in a startup, it can be a small group. I've been in the CoverCrest office when it was a handful of people, and just what are some of the key learnings or reflections? Because that's a really big deal on how you go about building your team, the people, all of that.
I think it's the being able to discern the mentality, the appetite, the willingness to know that when you're in a startup, you might have been hired for a job. There might be a really good job description about what your job is, but you're doing lots of other jobs. You have to, right? It's a collective effort. It takes everybody working together. I think, for a lot of the companies here in the St. Louis area, we benefit from all these talent that come out of places like Bear or Bungie, right, that have lived in the big corporate world. And sometimes that can be a really hard transition. Some people can make that transition very well. Maybe some people have gone and tried something first and they've understood what a startup environment is, so they have that understanding in place. But there's not going to be a pot of coffee when you come into the office that's just ready and available for you, right? You're going to have to make your own, and you might even have a coffee pot, right? I mean, all these things, or you might, right? I mean, I showed up to CoverCrest my first day, and we sat in a office space that was about the size of this stage, and there were, Tim, 6 of us that were in there, and desks that were pushed against the wall, and all trying to do phone calls and get work done. But it also creates, if you have a group that have that right mentality, that right mindset, the energy that gets built is just really fun. It's so exciting. So, and what's hard about it is in a small environment, when there's, you know, that old Sesame Street thing, which one of these is not like the other, it can be very noticeable, and you have to be able to quickly make that transition. You can't let those things kind of fester, so.
Yeah, I would say completely on that vein, but another dimension is, you know, reinforce, be prepared to change. You Jekyll and Hyde yourself, right? Because one day you're hosting a meeting in your basement outside your office, which would be intent to, you know, now you have multiple people and teams, and even them, it's like, no, every 6 months this culture is changing. And you don't get to go backwards. You don't get, you can't say, well, we used to be 6 of us. Or it used to be was yesterday. And to keep making progress, every day you're moving closer to a corporation, and this challenge of, you know, maintaining culture of entrepreneurial spirit, collaboration, but some magnitude of order, that it's not just 6 people. And, you know, that's a reality of, you know, that I go back at each one of these stages we went through is setting that stage. That I used the term with employee that we were talking about, man, this is rapid pace of change. And I said, you know, given where you are in your career, as one of the kids said, you know, I'm not surprised more panels haven't fallen off the space shuttle. You've done great. It's just, you know, is it always going to be this way? No, it'll probably get slightly worse, then much better, right? And that attitude, you know, resonates, and I'm very proud of the team, but always encouraging, you know, we don't want to get back to 6 people, right? And they're like, right. So, you know, it's everything about attitude, I think.
No, that's great. I remember when I was at New Leaf and I hired a young lady who had marketing communications background, and I asked her, I said, well, I'd also like you to be a sales rep too. And she was scared. And after 1 year, she was our leading sales rep. She hit out of the park. And I'm just bringing that up, and I still keep in touch with her. She's now at Bayer, but she said that experience, and you know, there are positions where you need someone very specific, maybe in a operations role, et cetera, but that ability to be a utility player, you know, I've used, kind of dating myself, the Jose Oquendo example a lot. That's extremely valuable, so appreciate that. All right. I think we've had a good discussion here. I'm not sure how we're tracking on time. Are there any other follow-up or final questions from the audience? If not, Dan and group here, I guess I'd like to wrap up with the following. And it's an honor to be up here with these 2 individuals, not just because of what we're talking about here today, but the thing that I want to layer in here with being at BioGenerator, if there's an opportunity for us to talk about St. Louis, talk about the ag technology ecosystem, the 2 individuals up here are the top 2 that you can count on to help out when we have people coming into St. Louis that raise their hand, that say, I want to be part of something. And I just, from our standpoint here, not only BioGenerator and BioSTL, but broadly, thanks for everything that you're doing for the ecosystem. If you're, you know, new into the space or you're a new startup, these 2 individuals will always make time to be available to listen and try to provide any insights. So thank you, Randy. Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.